All right, so this time you've really thrown down the gauntlet with this one.
Yeah.
A deep dive into James Joyce's Ulysses, famous for its stream of consciousness and all the dense layers.
Yeah.
Okay, challenge accepted. We've got excerpts spanning various characters and moments in the novel, and I think our mission here is to trace the narrative thread through this maze of Dublin on June 16th, 1904.
Yeah, I think what's exciting about that is we're not just picking out, the quote-unquote highlights, but sort of experiencing the story as it unfolds,
Yeah.
moment by moment,
Right.
through the eyes of these really unforgettable characters that Joyce has crafted.
Yeah, absolutely. So we begin with Stephen Dedalus, our brooding young intellectual. It's morning. He's at the Martello Tower with Buck Mulligan, who's this boisterous medical student.
Yeah.
There's clearly tension between them, even as Buck teases Stephen about his morning attire.
Yeah, the morning attire is key because it immediately kind of sets up this inner conflict. He's grieving for his mother, but feels stifled by all the social expectations of grief. And Buck, on the other hand, represents this more irreverent, cynical view of life and death.
Yeah, it's fascinating how Joyce just drops us right into this complex dynamic. Without a lot of exposition, we're immediately immersed in their world through these sharp and often humorous exchanges.
Right.
Like when Buck says, he can't wear those trousers, it's not the etiquette.
Yes.
And he's referring to Stephen's gray trousers.
Exactly. It's a seemingly trivial detail, but it really kind of speaks volumes about the social codes and expectations of the time. And then you have that image of the scared calf's face gilded with marmalade, which is just...
That's one that sticks with you.
Oh, it does.
What do you make of that image?
I think it's likely a flashback to Stephen's time at university and sort of connects to his feelings of guilt and anxiety. Joyce often uses these kind of seemingly absurd images to hint at deeper psychological states.
It's like a puzzle where every detail has this potential double meaning.
Precisely. And that's what makes Ulysses so rewarding. You're constantly discovering new layers and connections.
So as they're having breakfast, an Englishman named Haynes is also present, adding another layer to the whole dynamic.
Yes.
We get a sense of the tension between the Irish and the English, even in this seemingly mundane breakfast scene.
Yeah, Haynes really kind of represents the shadow of British colonialism looming over Ireland. And, Buck's insistence on Sandy Cove milk is like this subtle assertion of Irish identity, even at the breakfast table.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. We leave the tower and follow Stephen as he goes to tutor a young student named Sargent.
Right.
Here we see a different side of Stephen, a more compassionate, even tender side as he interacts with this young boy.
It's a poignant scene because Sargent is struggling with math, but also carrying the weight of his mother's recent death.
Yeah.
And Stephen really sees a reflection of his own grief in the boy's vulnerability.
And he describes Sargent's mother in such bleak terms. A trembling skeleton of a twig burnt in the fire. Heartbreaking.
Joyce doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of life and death, but he also kind of juxtaposes that bleakness with images of nature, like the fox scraping in the earth.
Right.
It's a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the persistence of the natural world, even in the face of loss.
Later that day, Stephen has a really tense encounter with Mr. Deasy, his headmaster. They clash over money and politics, highlighting the generational divide and the struggle between tradition and modernity in Ireland at the time.
Mr. Deasy very much represents the establishment clinging to these outdated values and obsessed with money. He even tries to give Stephen a letter to take to the newspapers, furthering his own political agenda.
And the setting of their conversation, Mr. Deasy's stuffy study, so symbolic.
Oh, yeah.
He's surrounded by Stuart coins, base treasure of a bog, representing this devalued past.
Exactly. And that stale, smoky air just reinforces this feeling of stagnation. It's like Stephen is literally and figuratively trying to escape that kind of suffocating environment.
Then we get a taste of Joyce's famous stream of consciousness technique as Stephen's walking on the beach.
Yes.
And his thoughts jump from one image to the next, seemingly random, yet they're revealing his inner anxieties and preoccupations.
This is where Joyce really breaks from traditional narratives.
Yeah.
We're plunged directly into Stephen's mind, experiencing his thoughts as they arise without filter or censorship. It can be challenging, but also incredibly rewarding as a reader.
He's thinking about Frauenzimmer, which I learned is German for women coming down to the sea, and then about history, religion, even his own sense of isolation. It's like we're eavesdropping on his internal monologue.
And within the stream of consciousness, you start to notice these patterns, recurring motifs, symbolic connections. It's like a tapestry where every thread contributes to this overall design.
So while Stephen is wrestling with his internal demons, we're introduced to Leopold Bloom, our second protagonist.
Right.
And he's preparing breakfast, but his thoughts are already racing. From thoughts of food, to fantasies about travel, to memories of his deceased son Rudy.
Bloom is this really fascinating contrast to Stephen. He's much more grounded in the everyday world,
Yeah.
preoccupied with bodily functions and these sensual pleasures.
Yeah.
Yet he's also capable of these profound philosophical musings.
Right, and there's this great detail about him loving kidneys for breakfast, but finding that tang of faintly scented urine unpleasant. It's so Joyce.
It is.
Finding humor and poetry in the mundane.
That detail is actually quite significant because it points to Bloom's sensuality, his deep connection to the physical world, and it kind of foreshadows these more carnal desires, which will definitely come into play later in the day.
He seems like this man of simple pleasures, yet his internal monologue is anything but simple. It's a whirlwind of observations, memories, and desires.
Bloom is the ultimate observer, just absorbing the sights and sounds and smells of Dublin. And Joyce uses his perspective to create this really vivid portrait of the city and its inhabitants.
So Bloom heads out for a very busy day, starting with a trip to the outhouse, which he refers to as the Jakes. Or he even manages to squeeze in some reading. Talk about multitasking.
Even in the most private of moments, Bloom is engaged with the world, absorbing information, making connections.
Yeah.
And that's part of what makes him such a captivating character. He finds meaning and wonder in the everyday, even in the outhouse. As Bloom kind of navigates the streets of Dublin, you get this incredible sense of the city coming alive. He's constantly encountering people, observing these little details, absorbing the energy of this bustling metropolis.
Like we're right there with him, walking alongside him as he takes in all the sights and the sounds. Like when he spots a funeral procession passing by and he's reminded of the fragility of life.
Yeah, that moment with the funeral procession really highlights Bloom's empathy and his awareness of mortality. And it kind of sets the stage for his attendance at Patty Dignam's funeral later in the day.
Okay, so while Bloom is making his way to the funeral, where do we find Stephen?
So meanwhile, Stephen has made his way to the National Library, and he's surrounded by other intellectuals, like the poet A.E., the librarian John Eglinton,
You're right.
engaging in these really deep discussions about literature history and the nature of art.
So Stephen's in his element here. He loves to debate and throw out these grand pronouncements.
Absolutely. This is where we see Stephen's brilliance on full display. He's a master of language and ideas, weaving together these complex arguments, challenging conventional thinking.
Like there's that line where he says, "A man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are volitional and are the portals of discovery." What do you make of that?
It's a pretty bold claim. And I think it gets to the heart of Stephen's artistic philosophy.
Yeah.
He's suggesting that true art is not about perfection, but about taking risks, exploring new ideas, even embracing failures as opportunities for growth.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially in a time when art was often seen as a way to uphold tradition and, social order.
Exactly. Stephen is really challenging those traditional notions, pushing the boundaries of what art can be.
Yeah.
And he's doing it through his own unique voice-blending intellectualism with a touch of rebellion.
So back to Bloom, he arrives at Patty Dignam's funeral, and we get a glimpse into his thoughts on death and burial, which are quite different from the more traditional religious views expressed by the other mourners.
Yeah, this is one of those moments where Bloom's really unique perspective shines through. He's very skeptical of rituals and dogma, and he tends to focus on the more practical aspects of death.
Right.
The decay, the logistics of burial, the impact on those left behind.
There's that striking image where he imagines all the beer brewed in Dublin.
Yeah.
Millions of barrels.
Yes.
And their contents spilling out, flowing together, winding through mudflats. What do you make of that?
It's a rather morbid image, but it's also quite beautiful in a way.
Yeah.
It speaks to the cyclical nature of life and death, the way that everything eventually returns to the earth. And there's a hint of humor in it, too, which is typical of Bloom.
Yeah, it's like he can't help but find humor even in the face of death.
Exactly, and that humor is part of what makes him so relatable. He's not afraid to acknowledge the absurdity of life, even in these most serious moments.
After the funeral, Bloom heads to work. He's an advertising canvasser, and we get a glimpse into his interactions with his colleagues and clients, which are full of this witty banter and these sharp observations.
Bloom is clearly a man who enjoys the hustle and bustle of the working world.
Yeah.
He's quick-witted, resourceful, and always looking for an angle.
It's fascinating how Joyce uses Bloom's work life to kind of shed light on the social and economic dynamics of Dublin at the time.
Exactly. We see the competitive nature of the advertising industry, the struggles of small businesses, the influence of politics on everyday life.
Bloom's day continues with just this whirlwind of encounters. Sandwich men, political rallies, even a glimpse of Blazes Boylan,
Oh, yes.
the man who's having an affair with Molly.
That encounter with Boylan is crucial. It's a brief moment, but it's so charged with tension and foreshadowing.
Right.
Bloom notices Boylan's spruce figure, the flash of his straw hat.
Yeah, it's like this silent acknowledgement of the situation.
Yeah.
Like this reminder of the betrayal that's hanging over Bloom's head.
Precisely, and it adds this layer of complexity to Bloom's character.
Right.
He's not just this jovial observer. He's a man grappling with jealousy, insecurity, the possibility of losing his wife.
And then there's Bloom's lunch at Dady Burns,
Yes.
where he savors this glass of Burgundy and indulges in his love of food. It's this moment of quiet pleasure amidst all the chaos of the day.
Yeah, that lunch scene is significant because it really showcases Bloom's sensuality and his appreciation for simple things in life.
Yeah.
He's fully present in the moment, enjoying the taste of the wine, the texture of the food, the atmosphere of the pub.
It's like this mini vacation for him, a chance to escape from all the pressures of work and the anxieties of his personal life.
Exactly, and it highlights the contrast between Bloom's outward ordinariness and this rich inner life he has. He may seem like an average guy, but he's capable of these profound depths of feeling and perception.
So as Bloom is finishing up his lunch, we shift back to Stephen, who's left the library and found himself in a pub, the Ormond Bar,
Right.
with a group of friends and acquaintances.
The Ormond Bar scene is one of the most dynamic and entertaining episodes in Ulysses. It's just this whirlwind of witty banter, philosophical debates, drunken revelry.
Stephen's holding court, surrounded by this really colorful cast of characters.
Mhm.
The boisterous Ben Dollard, the cynical Lenehan, the erudite Professor McHugh.
It's just this brilliant showcase of Joyce's ability to capture the energy and humor of a pub conversation. The dialogue is sharp, the characters are larger than life, the atmosphere is electric.
And then in a moment of pure Joyce and serendipity, Bloom walks into the pub.
This is the first time Bloom and Stephen are in the same room, though they haven't formally met yet.
Right.
And it's this pivotal moment because it really sets the stage for their eventual encounter
Yeah.
and their shared journey through this labyrinth of Dublin.
There's this sense that their paths are destined to cross, like they're drawn together by some unseen force.
Exactly, and it's so fascinating to watch Bloom kind of observe Stephen from a distance. He's intrigued by the younger man's intelligence and charisma, but also senses a kind of vulnerability in him.
It's like he sees a younger version of himself,
Hmm.
someone who's still searching for his place in the world.
And that connection, that sense of shared humanity, will ultimately draw them together in the most unexpected of ways.
Last we left off, Bloom and Stephen were in the same pub, but they hadn't actually met yet. What happens next?
Well, the Ormond Bar scene kind of descends into a bit of chaos. Stephen's had a fair bit to drink, and he gets into this heated argument that spills out into the street.
Oh no, sounds like trouble.
It is. He ends up in a brawl and is knocked to the ground. And who comes to his rescue but Leopold Bloom?
So they finally meet. What a dramatic way to bring them together.
Very Joyce, isn't it? This chance encounter born out of this chaos, it marks the beginning of their very unique relationship.
So Bloom takes Stephen under his wing.
Right.
Sort of this fatherly instinct kicking in.
You could say that. He sees Stephen's vulnerability and feels compelled to help him. He even takes him to a cabman's shelter for a cup of coffee and some conversation.
A cabman's shelter. That's a far cry from the intellectual atmosphere of the library or the boisterous pub scene.
Yeah, the shift in setting is deliberate. It strips away all pretense and brings Bloom and Stephen together in this moment of shared humanity.
And they actually start to open up to each other.
They do. Bloom shares stories of his travels, revealing this yearning for adventure and a fascination with the world beyond Dublin.
That's interesting because Stephen seems more trapped in his own head despite being this brilliant thinker.
Exactly. They represent two different ways of experiencing the world. Bloom is very grounded in the everyday, while Stephen is more focused on these abstract ideas and artistic pursuits.
There's this detail about Bloom showing Stephen this postcard from a sailor addressed to Senor Abudin in Chile. What's the significance of that?
That postcard is a bit of a mystery. Some see it as a symbol of Bloom's desire for escape, while others interpret it as a reminder of the interconnectedness of the world. It's up to the reader to decide.
Okay, so they leave the cabman's shelter and continue their journey through the night.
They do, and along the way, they encounter this drunken sailor who launches into this rambling speech about Ireland and England.
Oh, wow.
It's a reminder that politics is always simmering beneath the surface in Joyce's Dublin.
It's like even in these late-night encounters, the weight of history and national identity is always present.
Exactly. Joyce weaves these themes into the fabric of everyday life, showing how they shape the thoughts and actions of his characters.
And finally, Bloom takes Stephen back to his house on Eccles Street. It feels like this safe haven after the wild events of the night.
It is. The final scene takes place in Bloom's kitchen, a place of warmth and domesticity. They share some cocoa, and Stephen recites a poem he's written.
There's this sense of peace and connection in that moment, isn't there?
Absolutely. It's this quiet resolution after all the chaos and turmoil of the day, and it highlights the possibility of finding solace and understanding in the most ordinary of settings.
One of the most striking details is the Sula-Run exchange. Stephen writes it in Gaelic, and Bloom responds with a line of Hebrew. It's like they're communicating in this ancient, almost mystical language.
Yeah, that exchange is incredibly symbolic. It suggests the possibility of transcending cultural and linguistic barriers, finding common ground through this shared humanity.
And then Stephen leaves, heading back out into the night. And we're left with Bloom alone in his kitchen, lost in thought.
The novel ends with Bloom getting ready for bed, his thoughts drifting towards Molly, and we get a glimpse into their intimate life through her famous soliloquy, a stream of consciousness masterpiece that concludes with her resounding yes.
Wow, what a journey. We followed Stephen and Bloom through the streets of Dublin, experienced their triumphs and struggles, witnessed their unlikely connection. It's been quite a deep dive.
It has. Ulysses is a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it. It's a celebration of life in all its complexity, a testament to the power of language, and an enduring exploration of the human condition.
So what's the big takeaway here? What should our listener be pondering after this deep dive into Ulysses?
I think the main takeaway is that Ulysses is not about finding easy answers or these neat resolutions.
Yeah.
It's about embracing the journey with all its twists and turns, its moments of beauty and ugliness, its humor and despair. It's about seeing the world through new eyes, questioning assumptions, and finding meaning in the most unexpected of places.
Beautifully put. Maybe this deep dive has inspired you to pick up Ulysses for the first time, or perhaps to revisit it with fresh eyes. Either way, there's a whole world of discovery waiting for you within its pages. Thanks for joining us on this epic adventure.